Hello and welcome to another episode of Tips from the Top. My name is Rick Barron and I'm here today with Noreen Hayes. Noreen just retired as the Senior Vice President of Compensation and Benefits for Western and Southern Financial Group and is now serving as a consultant in the role of Chief Culture Officer. Thank you for joining me today, Noreen.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Would you tell me a little bit about the organization that you led at Western and Southern while you were there?
For 22 years, I was Senior Vice President of Human Resources for the Western Southern Financial Group. And that entailed all of the human resource functions in addition to security and food services.
Wow.
I had about 135 people in my organization and a budget of over $100 million a year, which included all of the benefits that we provide to our associates at Western Southern Financial Group.
Big role.
It was a big role for a wonderful company.
Yeah, big role. You spent literally the majority of your career with Western and Southern, is that true?
It was probably about half of my career.
Half?
I'm pretty old, so I originally started out as a teacher because I'm old enough that when women went to college, they became a teacher, a secretary, or a nurse, and I chose to become a teacher, and then Women's Lib came along, and I decided I could be anything I wanted to be, and I loved the structure of business, and I loved psychology. So I went back to graduate school and got my master's in industrial organizational psychology, and from there launched a human resources career.
Starting with Western and Southern or with somebody prior to that?
No, I started my career in human resources during the 1975 recession, and I started working for a very small metal manufacturing company in Dayton, Ohio, H.A. Jones Company, and served as their director of employee relations for approximately 6 years, and then moved on to Federated Department Stores. I worked at Reich's, Shillito, Reich's, and Lazarus through all the mergers, and ended up in Cincinnati when Shillito's and Reich's merged, and I was transferred to Cincinnati.
Wow.
From there I went to Burke Marketing Research, Sammy Burke at the time. That company was owned by Time Inc., and I served as their Vice President of Human Resources, and later joined Western Southern.
When you came into Western Southern, did you come in as a vice president or did you come in another role?
I came in as Vice President of Human Resources, and I was promoted after about 3 years to Senior Vice President.
So they
of
saw
Human
talent
Resources.
right away.
Well, they're a wonderful organization when it comes to recognizing talent and rewarding people who work hard for their organization.
If you look back over your career, has your leadership style changed at all over the course of time?
I would say it's definitely changed. I think I started out, as most young leaders do, in a very autocratic style, and learned over the years the benefits of a democratic leadership style and leading more through questions as opposed to direction. So that would be the style change that I made over the years, and the style that I think is most effective to develop people into leaders themselves.
That's some great insight in terms of how not only yourself personally, but in essentially the leadership discipline has evolved over time.
It has. It's been fascinating to watch and fascinating to be a part of it.
Yeah. Have there been any specific influences, mentors, books, seminars, anything else that you could reflect back on that have made a significant impact in the way that you lead?
I've always been fortunate to work for very strong, effective leaders. The people that I started out with at H.A. Jones was a family-run company, a very small company, were very much interested in what they were doing for their customers and what they were doing for their associates. And Doug Thompson, who was the chairman of Federated when I joined that, of Reich's when I joined that organization, was just a wonderful role model. And I found the same at Western Southern with John Barrett. Jack Brown at Burke Marketing was a tremendous influence in terms of understanding how to negotiate and move people in a direction that you wanted to go in. John Barrett at Western Southern has been phenomenal to watch in terms of his concern for the people around him and everything that he's willing to give the organization, our customers, and our community. So I've learned from all of those how to lead effectively, and it's been a wonderful journey.
Sounds to me like it was good selection on your part in terms of companies to work for based on the leadership that they had. Is there any truth to that?
There is absolutely truth to that. When people have asked me about my career, I said, choose your CEO wisely, because it's important, particularly in human resources, for your philosophy and the philosophy of the organization and the CEO to match, to be hand in glove. And if you're able to find that type of match, it's a wonderful relationship. It no longer becomes work, it becomes a wonderful journey.
So you had to do all this before we could just Google somebody and find the most recent article or their LinkedIn profile or the book that they wrote.
Right.
That must have taken some time and effort to do that.
Well, I don't know that I researched the leaders specifically, but I read the leaders that were interviewing me for an organization to determine whether or not I was going to be a fit for that organization and whether I was going to be able to do what they needed to have done to advance the organization the way they visioned it advancing.
Your new role at Western and Southern is Chief Culture Officer.
Yes.
And you had an opportunity at the very beginning to help define what the new culture, or at least the transformation of that culture, was going to be at Western and Southern. What role does leadership play in helping define the culture of an organization?
I think leadership at the top is responsible for defining the culture of an organization. So at Western Southern, John Barrett was a newly minted president when I joined the organization, and he had his views on where he wanted to take the organization and the type of organization he wanted to create. My job was to take his vision and his culture and determine how we could execute against that to make that a reality in the organization. And so once you've defined the culture and the values that the organization wants to uphold, then it becomes very important to create the infrastructure that's going to support that. How do you select people? How do you train them? How do you reward them? How do you develop them? How do you handle them in difficult circumstances? All of that has to reflect the culture that the person at the top of the organization wants to have in the organization. And that became the basis for changing the culture at Western Southern.
Each of the tools and the techniques that you just described, how long did that take to fully implement, to help make John's vision a reality?
Sure. Well, I'll say that culture is a never-ending journey. We're still working on the culture of Western Southern today. It took a while to get the culture started because we had an organization that had very tenured people who had been with the organization a long time, wonderful people who had grown up in a different time in the organization. And so it took some time for them to get used to where the organization was going and what they would need from them. And John was very instrumental in that. I asked him to start a series of town hall meetings where he would talk directly to the associates and communicate his vision for the organization and what he needed from us. And that was very instrumental in getting the message across the organization and starting the transformation of our culture. So it's very much a partnership among leaders in an organization.
And if you reflect back on your comment before, from autocratic to democratic, essentially what John did was share his vision, and then it sounds like employ this democratic process to say, what's the best way to get there? Is that?
His view is he has a vision, he knows what he wants to create, and he hires experts that he expects to execute against that vision. And so he was a wonderful partner in terms of listening to my ideas. Every once in a while he would say, "Are you sure?" And I'd say yes. And then I did one of those, "Please God, make that happen, and I'll never do anything wrong again in my entire life." And so things turned out well, and that instilled a sense of confidence in his part, in me. And we became a great team, I feel, in our organization. Focused on the culture, focused on the associates, focused on creating an organization where people wanted to stay, wanted to invest their career, and it's been a wonderful place for many of our associates to do that. Our turnover is very low. We prefer to promote from within. That's a big part of our culture. We do go outside whenever we don't have the requisite skills for a particular position, but that partnership between the organization and the associates is very real and very palatable, and so it's worked well for Western Southern Financial Group.
In a world where it's usually about making the next quarterly earnings,
Yes.
and stepping back and saying an organization made a significant investment. I'm sure this wasn't cheap and it wasn't quick,
Right.
in terms of how it got implemented. Did you ever calculate a rate of return on what the culture change has really meant to Western and Southern?
I haven't calculated a formal rate of return, but our change in culture is credited with a lot of our success in the organization. Since 1990, which is when John became president, actually, I think he was made president in '89. I joined the organization in '90, and we were at that point in time a life insurance company. We now have an annuity business, we have an investment management business, we have a real estate investment business through Eagle Realty Group. We've really expanded the organization, and we could not have done that without a group of people who were dedicated and focused and willing to do what the organization needed to be successful.
Sounds like that culture change was literally worth tens of billions of dollars every year.
Well, I know it's been worth a lot to the organization, and John credits our success to the culture. He often says that culture is the most important component in making a successful organization, and so we talk about that a lot, and we talk with our managers about culture and what their role needs to be in helping us shape and retain the culture that's important to our organization.
Sounds like there's more to come if he's bringing you back on as this culture officer, that your work there is still not finished.
It's not finished, and I'm very privileged that he's asked me to fill this role. I'm very excited about it. It's going to be a wonderful journey.
If you look at your leadership style, are there principles that you use that guide you in how you lead others?
I'll reflect on that by, I'll reflect on that by talking about a couple of pragmatic leadership studies that I think have shaped my career as a leader. And one of those, of course, is Ken Blanchard and his situational leadership model. And that focuses a leader on varying your style according to the developmental needs of your associates. So that if you have an associate who is new and doesn't have a clue about what they're doing, you're going to be very directive. If, as people acquire the skills necessary for doing their job, you become more supportive. And when people are at the highest level of development, you're the cheerleader on the side, cheering them on, and being there if they have any problems or if they need any assistance. So that's one theory of leadership that I found to be very helpful over my career. Another would be Jim Collins and his Level 5 leadership, and his focus on effective leaders being those individuals who look outside the window when something goes right and credit the team, and look in the mirror when something goes wrong and say, what else could I have done that would have netted a better result? So those are two theories that I've focused on and that we've taught heavily at Western Southern, and our management teams have found those to be very helpful in shaping their leadership styles.
Thank you. If you just joined us, you're watching Tips from the Top with my guest, Noreen Hayes. Noreen had a 20-plus year career with Western and Southern Financial Group and is now serving as a consultant for their Chief Culture Officer. Noreen, how have you developed leaders in your organization? I mean, using the models that you described from Ken Blanchard and Jim Collins, you actually have to execute them, right?
Yes, you
and
do.
You have to work with people.
Yes,
and
you do.
Many times when you work with people, that can be difficult. Are there some other skills or techniques that you've used to help develop the leaders in your organization?
I would reference a few for the people who worked for me directly. I think it's important for people to get honest feedback from their managers, both in terms of what the manager values about what they're doing and what areas, what opportunities they have for development. So people who have worked for me have received a lot of feedback on what they're doing, both positive and here are some things that you might want to change or to work on. And then beyond that, when you're focusing on an area that needs to be developed, asking them questions. Did that go the way you wanted it to go? What do you think caused it to end up in that situation? If you were doing it again, how would you do it over? Those types of questions help people think through leadership as a process and develop the mental maps to help them develop as leaders going forward. So those very necessary skills and approaches can become part of their everyday repertoire as a leader.
In many cases, what I'm hearing you say is you do more listening than anything else.
I think listening is very important so that you understand where the person is coming from. And I think you have to balance how much are you listening and how much are you guiding. And that balance should be dictated by what developmental level your associate is at currently.
Mm-hmm. You've been very successful throughout your career and in an industry that was typically led by males. Do you have any insights for our female viewers out there who may be wanting to know, is there something that you could share with them that would help them as potentially they struggle with similar things?
I would say the most important thing, and I speak from my own experience, the most important thing to me was not to pay attention to gender differences or to look for discriminatory effect, but to really focus on what are my goals, how am I going to get there, what type of job am I doing. And I had a lot of faith. It was blind faith initially, but I had a lot of faith that if I did the right things, worked hard and got results, I'd be rewarded for that. So that's what I focused on. What's my objective? Where do I have to take this initiative? And how do I get it there? And then everything else I push out of the way. I don't pay attention to. Just focus on the task at hand. What am I going to do to be successful at that task at hand? And everything else will take care of itself. That's been my experience. I can't say that's the experience for everybody, but it's worked for me over a 40-year career.
And it sounds like you've selected great leaders to
Absolutely.
work for, and that made it a lot easier.
Absolutely.
Working for people who were focused on not only growing the organization, but growing those people within that organization.
And who had great values and good philosophies. That was very important. To me, hell on earth would be being the head of human resources in an organization where your philosophy and your approach was different than the head of the organization. It has to fit hand in glove to be successful. And I was fortunate in being selected by leaders that fit the bill for me.
Good point. Really says that we need to know internally what our values and principles are, what drives us, and as we go out and look to share those with organizations, to try to align those with organizations.
Absolutely.
Rather than just force them to be able to have work.
It changes it from being a job to being a joy.
And that's how you bring passion, I think, to the work.
Absolutely. You have to be passionate about the product that your company is producing, and you have to be passionate about the values and the vision of the organization that you're with.
You've had a lot of experience serving on nonprofit boards. And if you reflect back on the boards that you have served on, was there some specific leadership skill from the profit world that you brought to those organizations in the nonprofit world?
I would say one of the major things I brought to positions that I had in the nonprofit world is a focus on results. Identifying what those results needed to be, how we were going to measure them, and then using those metrics to refine our approach to the results. And I, again, in non-for-profit organizations, worked with directors of not-for-profits that were very good leaders in their own right and very receptive to ideas and new ways of looking at things.
Most organizations are formed around some mission, those nonprofits.
Yes.
Some mission, some transformation, something they're trying to achieve. What I'm hearing from you is to really get down to the nitty-gritty, and that is, how well are we doing it?
Absolutely.
And can we measure our activity against those results?
Absolutely. How can you tell whether you're being successful at that mission or not?
Identifying those key factors, if you will.
Yes.
In terms of what is our mission all about?
And how would you measure and define success? What does success look like? If we're successful, what's going to change? And how much is that going to change?
Probably falls into the same discussion we just had around understanding personal values and vision. How do I know when I've achieved what it is that I'm after?
Absolutely.
As well? Yeah.
And I think it's very important for individuals to always assess, where am I against what I wanted to be, what I wanted to do, how I wanted to live, and understanding that the approach you take to your situation can determine the results. I read an article recently. I graduated from Ohio State, so Urban Meyers, I think, should run for president in 2016. But I read an article about the leadership style that they use to develop the Ohio State Buckeyes to a winning leadership team. And Urban came across a consultant who had a phrase, E plus R equals O. Event plus your response equals the outcome. And when I read that, I was absolutely amazed at how empowering that phrase was, to know that any event that comes along, I can't control the event all the time, but I can control my response to that event. And my response to that event is going to help dictate the outcome for that event. That is tremendously empowering, and I think tremendously important for people to understand to be successful.
Almost like you have to be a third party watching your response so that you can judge how well you're doing.
And you have to be aware of the fact that you can choose your response. Here's the event. What's the best way for me to respond to get the outcome that we need to have? Consciously selecting that response instead of throwing passion to the wind and automatically going in a direction without thinking it through.
I'd like to explore the comment that you made about self-assessment and how important self-assessment was in developing leadership. Any tools that you found to be most effective, or techniques? I mean, we always hear getting feedback from the boss. Mm-hmm. This concept of you've got responsibility to evaluate yourself.
Yes.
How have you found the most effective way to do that?
I've found it to be very effective to look at a situation and say, how did that go? Did it reach the objectives that I was striving for? And ask that question. What could I have done differently as a leader to net the result that we wanted to net? So that self-reflection is critical, and it's also important, I think, to listen to the people around you, whether you're team members or the people reporting to you or people out in the organization. One of my favorite things to do was to go out into the organization and talk to people about what they would change. If they were king for a day, what would they do differently? And use that as feedback for the organization, but you can also use that as feedback for yourself in terms of what you should be doing differently. So I think that concept of soliciting feedback from people around you is very, very important. A boss's feedback is important, but bosses are busy people,
Yeah.
and they sometimes don't have all the time that you would like to have to receive that feedback.
And as you stated earlier, not only asking the question, but knowing enough to be quiet and listen to the answer.
And to be receptive to the answer. Listen to understand rather than listening to refute.
Yes. To really take in the feedback that's being presented, not come up with excuses or alibis
Exactly.
in terms of why. Use it as a learning experience, if you will.
Exactly.
Yeah. There are probably things that you know now, do now, believe now, that 20, 30 years ago would have been helpful in your career. Are there any of those insights that you could share that says, kind of as you're winding down your career, what would be something that you kind of take for granted now that you wish you'd known that many years ago?
Well, I'll tell you something I haven't mastered yet. That when I look back on my career and say, what would I have done differently? What area of study would I have pursued more significantly? And that's understanding finance. Understanding finance in business. I've learned over the years, I can get through a balance statement and all of those good things, but really getting into the nuts and bolts of finance, I think is important to all leaders in an organization so they understand the underpinnings of that organization. And at my age now, I think it wouldn't have been too shabby to have that information for my personal finances as well.
Yes.
So if I were teaching again, I would make certain that there was more emphasis on finance within our school system and within professional development.
Noreen, we've only got about a minute left. In terms of where you are in your career, what's next for you? What's your vision for the next year, 2, 3? I don't know how long you're planning on working, but what's your vision for the next couple of years?
Well, having just retired, that vision is being formulated as we speak. However,
most retirees aren't getting chief culture officer roles.
I know. And that is just a dream job. I'm going to love working with the people at Western Southern to enhance our culture and to embed our culture very significantly in the organization. I believe John Barrett when he says culture is one of the foundations of organizational strength and organizational success. So I'll be spending a lot of time determining how we can refine and enhance our culture and embed it more deeply in the organization so we can continue our wonderful road of success.
Another dozens of billions of dollars worth of growth in Western and Southern Financial.
It would be wonderful.
Thank you, Noreen, for joining us. You've been watching Tips from the Top with my guest, Noreen Hayes, the Chief Culture Officer for Western and Southern Financial Group.